Hello and welcome. My name is Alex Bearden and I'm your instructor. In this video we're going to cover analyzing arguments. This video focuses on the basics of logical arguments and presents a method for analyzing arguments. Philosophy is all about arguments, so this is a foundational skill for the course, and you'll be asked to evaluate arguments frequently. Reasoning, or thinking clearly and critically, is a skill that you can develop with practice and patience. Part 1 introduces a method of critical analysis for arguments. Part 2 presents some arguments where we will practice applying this method of analysis. Philosophy is all about arguments, so we need to know what an argument is. So let's first be clear about what an argument is in our sense of the term. Often it's helpful to start with what an argument is not. An argument is not merely a verbal fistfight or dispute. Also, an argument is not just a clever way of restating your own prejudices and opinions. Opinions are mere assertion, that is, they are stated without any support or evidence. The goal of an argument is to provide support, reason, and evidence for claims that could be accepted by anyone. Good arguments involve more than just true content and must also follow certain rules of inference. These rules are identifiable patterns of reasoning that regularly produce true conclusions if the premises are true. So we can say that an argument is a series of tightly connected statements intended to prove or establish something. The point the argument aims to express is called the conclusion, and the statements that offer reason or evidence to support it are called premises. We'll unpack these concepts as we move forward. Let's first pause to ask a skeptical question. Why argue? Some people think that arguments are pointless and get us nowhere. But in order to believe this claim, we would need to consider reason and evidence. In other words, we wouldn't be able to evaluate this claim without reasoning about it. In short, we'd have to consult arguments. Arguments are essential to evaluating diverse viewpoints, which is an essential and fundamental skill. Not all viewpoints are equal. Some are better than others because they offer better and more compelling reasons in support or fit best with the existing evidence. Studying arguments helps us determine whether a conclusion is well-founded, true, or follows from the available evidence. Some arguments, on the other hand, offer weak support, make errors in reasoning, or consider irrelevant information. One of our tasks is to sort out the good arguments from the bad. So in that sense, learning about arguments is really a form of inquiry that can shape our beliefs. Let's consider an example. We're going to read an argument that concludes that zoos are immoral. Is that a correct conclusion? If you ask people, you'd probably find most people disagree with this conclusion initially. But how do we find out who is right? Popular opinion doesn't always tell us what is best. Likewise, referring to personal experience doesn't help us decide the matter either. The author who argues for this conclusion doesn't just consult his own experience or force his opinion. Rather, he uses arguments to inquire into the question of whether zoos are morally justified. This is an abstract and conceptual inquiry involving many different parts, but it's presented without many controversial background assumptions. He considers the best arguments in favor of zoos and then offers arguments against each one to demonstrate why those reasons are insufficient, false, or unjustified given the implications to animals' well-being in our interest as human beings. Many students find, after thinking hard about this argument, that it challenges their own view. At the same time, you may not have had an explicit view on the moral status of zoos before coming into this class. Like most, you may have simply taken the practice for granted without thinking about it. Given that consulting arguments challenges what conclusions we may hold implicitly, after more reflection, there are two basic ways to resolve the challenge. You might either consider revising or changing your own viewpoint in light of these arguments, or if you disagree, you can offer counter-arguments that try to expose a mistake in the author's reasoning. Counter-arguments aim at showing where the author goes wrong. Is there some relevant empirical evidence he overlooks? Is there a better argument involving the concepts he employs that support a competing conclusion? Does he have suppressed premises or controversial assumptions that, if exposed, should lead us to reject his argument? Since disagreement will probably persist, we continue to need arguments. Those who disagree offer arguments of their own, and those who agree will need to defend their conclusions with additional arguments. Arguments aim to expose the reasons that are clear, objective, relevant, and accessible so that people can decide for themselves what viewpoint to hold. What's not so important is whether you accept one particular conclusion over another, but no matter what your view, it's essential that your conclusion is supported by good reason and evidence. If it's not, it's unreasonable to suppose that anyone will agree with you. There are many compelling arguments for a diversity of viewpoints, so arguments don't establish only one correct way to view things. It's great to keep an open mind, but that doesn't mean you can't be critical too. You'll have to think carefully about the arguments, offer some of your own, and discuss with others, and determine with thoughtful reflection which arguments are most compelling and why. Arguing takes practice. It's a skill that you can develop if you practice, and we will get plenty of practice in this course. But let's begin with some of the basics, the fundamentals of arguments. As stated earlier, arguments involve statements that are arranged in a particular way. A statement is a sentence that asserts something. Statements have the property of truth value, that is, statements are either true or false. An argument is a particular kind of arrangement of at least two statements that are characterized in two ways. One group of statements are referred to as premises. The point of the premises is to provide evidence or support for the conclusion with reasons. The other type of statement is the conclusion, which is the point that the argument aims to establish. The conclusion of a good argument is said to follow logically from these premises. Of course, not all arguments are successful at establishing their intended conclusion, and that's why we have to critically evaluate them. Let's look at a simple example to help make it more concrete. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. How do we decide if this is a good argument? First, let's make sure we understand what's going on. To do so, let's identify the premises and conclusion. All arguments must have, at minimum, one premise and one conclusion. Many arguments, such as this one, have more than one premise. To identify the difference between premises and conclusions, look for key words or phrases. Certain words indicate a conclusion, words like therefore, thus, it follows that, hence, so, we may conclude, etc. Premises also use indicator words. Look for words like because, since, for, as indicated by, in that, may be inferred from, given that, etc., when trying to identify premises. Look at the example argument. We can tell that the last statement, Socrates is mortal, is the conclusion since it uses a conclusion indicator word, therefore. Notice that I reached a conclusion about what the conclusion was by reasoning about it, with the available evidence. If someone asked why that's the conclusion, I could simply state that the presence of an indicator word therefore suggests that what follows is the conclusion. You probably do this every day. You utilize simple inferences and arguments without even realizing it. Now, turning back to the argument example, since we have identified the conclusion, we find that the remaining two statements are the premises. Let's continue to work with this simple example argument to set up a basic structure for critically analyzing arguments. There are three basic questions to ask when we come across an argument, which help us determine whether it's good or bad, and we'll need to develop some technical vocabulary along the way as well. The three questions that we'll ask in order to analyze arguments are the following. Is the argument clear? Is the argument valid or invalid? Are the premises true? Is the argument sound or unsound? That last question is divided into two parts. We'll talk about each of these as we proceed. The first question to ask is whether the argument is clear. Can you understand what it is saying? What point is it trying to prove and how? In other words, can you identify the premises and conclusion? Most of the readings for this class have the value of being quite clear and well organized, but they are also abstract and dense, so it may take some work on your part to get it clear. The second question to ask when analyzing arguments is about validity, which is an important technical term in logic. Validity is a property of arguments, so we say that arguments are either valid or invalid. Philosophers use this word slightly differently from how most use it. When someone says that's a valid point, they often mean that the point is true. That is not what validity means in our case, so take caution not to confuse validity with another important concept, truth, which has its own technical name, soundness. For this reason, it would be a mistake to say that an argument is true or false. Truth is a property of statements, not of arguments. Remember that arguments are particular arrangements of statements. When we talk about validity, we're talking about the arrangement itself. Validity, in our sense, has to do with the formal structure of the argument. In other words, we ask, is the reasoning presented in a reliable way such that the conclusion follows inferentially and necessarily from the premises? Valid arguments are valid always, regardless of any content we might plug in. Validity in our sense has nothing to do with the content. It's exclusively about the form or arrangement of the statements themselves. As stated earlier, good arguments follow certain rules of inference that will produce a true conclusion if the premises are true. Let's return to the example argument. Is this argument valid? To determine this, imagine that the premises are true, even if you think they might not be. Does the conclusion necessarily follow? In valid arguments, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. But notice that we do this without needing to have true premises. Pretend or imagine or grant for the sake of argument that each premise is true. If the premises are true, does the conclusion have to be true? If so, it's valid. If not, it's invalid. One trick, which can take some practice, is to formalize the argument by exposing the skeleton of the inference. In order to do this, we can leave words that reveal the logical structure. Those are words like all, no, some, are not, if then, either or, if and only if, no, or it is not the case that, and then replace the important terms or statements in between with a symbol, often a single capital letter. In our example argument, the words all, are, and is are the words that reveal the logical structure. So let's set those aside. Then we can use symbols that help us keep track of the terms in between. Our example argument gives a general feature that all humans have. We can symbolize humans as H and mortality as M. Likewise, we'll use the letter S to stand in for Socrates. The first premise is that all H are M. The next premise gives an instance of a particular human, Socrates, so we get S is H. Since all H, that is humans, have the feature M, that is mortality, then a particular human S, which we know from premise 2 is H, must also have feature M. So S is M. It is impossible for this conclusion to be false if both premises are true. Hence, exposing the structure reveals that this is a valid argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The final question for analyzing arguments focuses on the truth of the premises. Remember that truth is a property of statements, not of arguments. We will break this final question into two parts. The first asks us to go through each premise one by one, asking if the premise is true or false. The second asks about all the premises of the argument together. Note that we don't look at the conclusion at all, only the premises. If the argument is valid, we can ask whether it is sound or unsound. Here again, we have important technical terms from logic. A sound argument is one where all the premises are true. All invalid arguments are automatically unsound, so if we can show that the argument is invalid, we know immediately that it's unsound. If the argument is valid but has at least one false premise, then it is unsound. So again, if the argument is valid, we first go through each premise to determine whether it's true or false. If we find one false premise, the argument is unsound. If none of the premises are false, then the argument is sound. And again, if the argument is invalid, it's automatically unsound. Let me say a little bit more about the first task by asking whether each premise is true. Here, you're trying to come up with reasons for the premise to be false. You're not trying to prove them true. That's a subtle but important difference. If you're trying to prove them false, then you might suggest a reason that is contrary to what you believe, maybe even something crazy. This is sometimes called a counterexample. All you're trying to do is to consider what might make someone else's claim, that is, a premise in an argument, false, even if such considerations are outlandish. Let's briefly pause to consider another example where the counterexample to a premise will help show the argument is unsound. Killing is always wrong. Abortion involves killing a fetus. Therefore, abortion is wrong. Of the two premises, the second is clearly factually true. To abort is to kill the fetus. But what about the first premise? Is it false? See if you can identify a counterexample. What would show that the claim, killing is always wrong, is false? If we successfully provide a counterexample, we'll show the premise is false and the argument is unsound. Maybe you have an idea already. Many people think that killing in self-defense is not wrong. So that's one example that shows that it's not always the case that killing is wrong. One might defend the premise against our self-defense counterexample, but to do that, it would require showing that all cases of self-defense that result in killing are wrong, which is a difficult task. The burden of proof is on the one who advances the claim killing is always wrong, not on you. Let's consider a second and more controversial counterexample. Again, remember that you don't have to agree, you're just looking for anything that might suggest this premise is false. What about killing animals or plants? Most people don't think that kind of killing is wrong. The premise doesn't overtly specify whether it's only killing of human beings that counts. But if the common view that killing animals or plants is not wrong is correct, then it's not always the case that killing is wrong. This premise probably supposes tacitly that we're talking only about humans, so the first counterexample is probably stronger. Furthermore, we probably should have resolved this issue in the first question about clarity. we would need to clarify that killing refers to killing human beings. But even so, we had a counterexample that showed it's not always wrong to kill. Thus, we have a reason to think that the premise is false. What is at stake in this argument is whether abortion is a wrongful form of killing. We offered a counterexample to show that the first premise is false, so this is not a good argument. If abortion is wrong, we're going to need to try another argument to establish that conclusion. And there are many compelling arguments on both sides of the issue. The evidence in this argument, however, is inadequate to establish the conclusion. Returning to our simple argument involving Socrates, do we have reason to suppose that either premise is false? Unfortunately, premise 1 is true. We will all die. That's just what it means to be mortal. The second premise is also true. Socrates was a man, a famous philosopher in Athens some 2,400 years ago. Since both premises are true, the argument is sound. Of course, you might think, maybe Socrates is my cat's name, in which case, premise 2 would be false. If so, then you came up with a good counterexample. But we also want to be charitable to the argument like we did with the example above. It's probably more likely that, without any other context or information, the author of the argument means to denote the philosopher Socrates rather than my cat. So this argument is valid and sound. My cat's name is Shay, by the way. There's Shay. She's with my son William when he's a little baby. They haven't gotten much more friendly than you see there. Shay. Okay, so let's wrap up. In this video, I have introduced the basics of arguments and provided a method for critically evaluating arguments. Learning this skill takes practice, so in part 2, I will go through some argument examples to help us become more familiar with analyzing them. You'll have opportunities to practice on your own in other assignments as well. Thanks for watching.